This past summer, I had the opportunity to study with a gentleman who Rabbi Friedman Cole has known for many years and who has become very important in my life recently because he's my doctoral advisor, Rabbi Dr. Byron Sherwin of Spertus College. And there seems to be two different types of research that are done in Judaic studies. One, in which was highlighted this past Tuesday by Professor Rabbi David Weiss Halivni, who just won the Israel Prize for Lifetime Research in Talmud. And that type of research is one in which you look at words, and you try to look at the words in their context and try to understand their original sources and what these words mean. And hopefully in that method, we'll be able to derive more meaning for our lives. The other type of research is what Spertus College seems to want to teach, and what Dr. Sherwin has dedicated his life to teaching, and that is looking at issues from a cross view of Jewish literature to see what the ethics and morality of Judaism has to say about any given topic. And from there, we can start making decisions in terms of how we should respond to these issues as Jews. And so the topic for this morning is Superman versus Frankenstein. Issues of cloning and issues of embryonic stem cell research. We can even get out the issue of embryonic and just talk about stem cell research. I don't know if people have been following the newspapers around the world or North America, but the Associated Press, just a few months ago, November 13th, 2007, had the following article. And I just want to quote a little bit from it. Scientists in Oregon say that they've reached the long-sought goal of cloning monkey embryos and extracting stem cells from them, a potentially major step towards doing the same thing in people, humans. The issue raised by this scientific breakthrough, simply put, and quote, is cloning human life the next step on the scientific agenda? And if so, is this a negative or a positive advancement for science, ethics, and morality in the 21st century? So my first question to everyone here is, why would we want to even consider the possibility of doing stem cell research or even the possibility of cloning people? And I'd like to hear what you have to think about that topic. Yes, sir. Okay. Excellent. There is an awful lot we can learn on a duplicate so that we can go back to the original and maybe make life better. It's a very interesting way you phrase that. I like it a lot.
I don't think it's natural for people to copy. Like, one person is one person. Like, I should say that one person and people should be copied.
So it's fascinating because without me even paying them and prompting them, they gave us right now the world's issues in very short statements on what the debate is. In some ways, we can almost classify this as the Jewish view versus the Christian view. All right? And we'll get to that. Just want to keep that in mind for a moment. What I would like to just simply ask is I want to get into the comic books for a moment, knowing that we have some young, mature adults here, and some of us young, mature adults who have not grown up yet. We still like comic books. Superman, originally created prior to 1933, but in its current iteration in 1933 by two Jewish boys, one from Toronto, the other from Cleveland, Ohio. The one from Toronto ends up moving to Cleveland, Ohio. And so I'm just going to throw out there, from your watching of the movies and reading the comic books over your life, what was the purpose of the creation of Superman as you and I know him today? Okay, and what was his role, his mission? Say that louder. Superman's role is to save people, i.e. planet Earth, from ultimate destruction against evil forces. Okay? Similar to the Harry Potter versus Voldemort situation, right? You got the dark force, and you have the positive force. What was going on in the world in 1933? Hitler came to power. And so in the earlier editions of the Superman comic, who was pitted as the evil empire? Hitler and the Nazi regime. And Superman was the Golem, the creation of humans in order to protect Jewish and world interests. We're going to talk a lot about the Golem because it's a legend that comes somewhere between the 16th and 19th centuries. It is giving credit to Rabbi Judah Loew from Prague, the Maharal of Prague, though there is some academic question whether it should be applied to him because we have sources that we're going to look at that go back much farther than he, which have major implications for the issues that we're talking about. But let's take a stop for a second. We know that the Superman character was created, at first, by the way, he was actually created as an evil character, but then no one would buy into it. No comic book strip would actually pick it up, and so they reworked him in light of what was happening in Europe to be a positive character to save humanity, and look what happened. It's become the world's most famous comic book and the most sold and watched and read comic book strip to date. The Golem was originally created, according to legend, in order to do what? To work for what purpose? Yeah, okay. In some versions of the legend, it was definitely almost like a slave. But ideally, the Golem was created in order to protect the Jews of Prague and of Eastern Europe from pogroms and other attacks that Jews were facing. And so you could see the connection between the Golem legend and that of Superman, both trying in a positive way to protect humanity. Frankenstein, the original Frankenstein, that is the book written by Mary Shelley. What was the purpose of Frankenstein?
Frankenstein's the doctor. You mean Frankenstein's monster.
Perhaps. It's a two-sided thing. It's kind of like the Hulk, right? You have David Brenner, and then you have the Hulk. And depending on the emotion, it changes, okay? Can I have a volunteer? Somebody with a very large airwaves. You. Please look at the second source on the sheet, and can you read it out loud? Go ahead. Stand up if you want.
You know what it says, Frankenstein?
That's correct.
Description from Barnes and Noble Classic Books.
Right, you know that you can get on Barnes & Nobles and for like anywhere from $2 to $7 Canadian, you can go ahead and buy classic works of literature. They have like over 400 of them. And in the first part of the book is an introduction. They actually have PhDs who actually help you break down some of the literary motifs and help you teach the book as you go ahead and read the book. So it's a wonderful thing. So this is where I got it from. Go ahead.
Mary Shelley began writing Frankenstein when she was only 18. At once a gothic thriller, passionate romance, and a cautionary tale about dangers of science. Frankenstein tells the story of committed science student Victor Frankenstein, obsessed with discovering the causes of generation in life and bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. Frankenstein assembles a human being from stolen body parts, but upon bringing it to life, he recoils in horror at the creature's hideousness. Tormented by isolation and loneliness, the once innocent creature turns to evil and unleashes a campaign of murderous revenge against his treaty.
Thank you. So we have this Dr. Frankenstein, who is a human, and what does he do? He creates a golem, and what happens to that particular golem? It gets out of control, and it causes havoc upon people and upon towns. There's part of the golem legend from the Maharal of Prague who says that the way that the golem was activated after it was formed is that Rabbi Loew would place a small parchment under its tongue, or in other versions would write words on the golem's head, and in order to deactivate, you would either erase part of the word on the forehead of the golem, or you'd take out the parchment from the golem's mouth. It's very similar to the early computers with the punch cards, right? The computer would not work at all unless you actually put in the data, right? And then the minute you took it out, the whole computer would stop. Different than what we have today, but some basic similarities there. But with the part of the legend of the golem, it teaches us that every Friday, right before Shabbat, Rabbi Lo will go ahead and remove the parchment from the golem's mouth. And the golem would be deactivated, and he would reactivate the golem Motzei Shabbat after Shabbat was over. Except on one Friday, he was so busy in doing his work for the community and preparing for Shabbat that he forgot to take the parchment out, and the golem became very agitated and started raising trouble and havoc all over the community, started destroying homes, and Rabbi Lo was finally summoned to take control of this golem, and he deactivated him. The lesson that we can learn from both Frankenstein and this negative view of the golem from the Maharal of Prague is simply that sometimes our creations get beyond our control. And we have to learn how we can take reign over them again, how we can be in more control over the things that we put our heart and soul and effort into. I'd like to now jump into, to the best way I possibly can, the issues of cloning and of stem cell research. I'd like us to take a step back, and when we look at cloning, not necessarily look at making a duplicate of you or me, but perhaps there might be other reasons why we would want to engage in this endeavor. Let's say we need to have a liver for somebody, or a heart transplant. Or perhaps with stem cells, for example, my cantor emeritus, Louis Danto, who is suffering from Parkinson's disease right now, if we had the technology and the continued research, perhaps he would not be in such a situation of suffering from that. Hang on for 1 second. Let's go back a little even farther. Do you remember when the first heart transplant was done? Was the entire world in favor of that? No. In fact, the arguments today on stem cell research and of cloning are the same arguments that happened back then. It's playing God. It's usurping the natural order of the world, and therefore we should not engage in these things. I have to tell you from personal experience. 5 years ago, as we were about to move to Toronto, my wife was going through cancer treatments because she had been diagnosed that October with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. If it wasn't for what we'll learn to be the Jewish view end up influencing legislative acts in North America and allowing certain research to be done, I am not so sure she'd be with us today. And I know I'm not the only story like that out there. There are many stories. But let's kind of go ahead and look at how we begin making Jewish decisions on these topics. I'd like you to look at source 3. And this source comes from the Babylonian Talmud and Tractate Sanhedrin. The first line is a quote, and it reads as follows: Ki im avanotechem hayu mavdilim b'neichem levein Elohechem. The difference between humans and God is what? It's that God doesn't sin. Humans sin, make mistakes. Now, I'm not going to go into major theology over that. That's a very loaded statement, and we can argue that, especially in the 20th century or after the 20th century, in light of the Holocaust and other issues. But according to this text, that's the difference between you, me, and God. Let's continue with the text. Amar Rava, one of the great sages of the Talmud, Rava says, I ba'u tzadikei baru alma. If the tzadikim wanted to create the world, Shenetmar, just quotes the text we just read, Ki avanotechem hayu mavdilim v'gomer. The difference is because that, if humans wanted to create a world, Well, they couldn't because they sin and God doesn't. Therefore, only God can do that. What's the lesson we learn from that? Is that if humans don't sin, if humans are tzaddikim, pure, righteous people, then they might be able to do the same thing that God does. How many people like magic? What's the difference between magic, illusionary acts, and witchcraft and wonder-making? Right? Those are all different titles we use for this endeavor, but they're really different. Well, let's see if we can get an answer here. Look at the next statement. Rava bara gavra. Rava creates gavra, a man, an entity. Look at the words for a second. When you go to do a magic trick, when you go to pull the coin out of the child's nose or the child's ear or the rabbit out of the hat, what words do you say before you go ahead and yank that rabbit out? Abracadabra. What do the words abracadabra mean? First of all, what language is it in? It's Arabic. Okay? And what does the words actually mean? Well, you say it, you should know what it means, right? We should. Does anyone have an idea? Okay, it has to do with creation. Essentially, it's saying, by these words, I will create. What do we say every morning at the beginning of Pesukei de Zimra? It's a midrash on how God creates the world. Baruch Shemar v'haya ha'olam, right? God spoke and the world was created. It's interesting. Abracadabra. Somebody spell it for me. Go ahead. Okay. No, it's a C. It's a C. The third letter of the English alphabet is C. The third letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Gimel. Do me a favor. Look at these words that we just read. Rava bara gavra. If you change the letters around, right, put them out of this sentence, what do you have? Abracadabra. The Gimel gets replaced with a C in the English alphabet. It's the same letter, essentially, not by sound, but in numerical order. And you have the same sort of mystical, magical connotation here. Nonetheless, Rava, bara gavra, Rava creates a man, and look what happens. Shedare l'kaimei de Rabbi Zera. And this man, this gavra, goes up to Rabbi Zera. Havakai mishta'eh b'hadeh. And he speaks. That is, Rabbi Zera speaks to this gavra, and look what happens. Velo havakai mahadar le. And this creation, this gavra, this golem, does not respond. Amar le, Rabbi Zera yells back at this gavra, Min chavara'at bahadar la'afar rich. You, sir, you can't respond to me? You are the source of artificial life. You are from magicians. Return to where you came. Return to the dust of the earth. All right, how was the golem made? By taking the earth and forming, similar to Adam, which we'll talk about later. It's fascinating. At this point in this story, what do we have? We have an example dating back somewhere between the 1st and 2nd century of where a human went ahead and created another entity that looks like a human, with the exception it did not have the intelligence, the ability to speak. Now, you're going to have to take my word for this, but I've given you the site so you can go ahead and research it yourself. There are no commentaries that argue that what Rava did was wrong. Can you imagine that? Can we clone? Forget why we should or shouldn't do it. The issue, can we actually, from an ethical Jewish perspective, do it? It seems clear that we can, because in this text, no one says you can't do it. There's not one commentary, and I would imagine that there would be. Rashi makes a commentary. Rashi's comment on this is, yeah, if you're going to do it, hesitate. Be careful in your approach to doing it. I interpret that as have your check and balance to make sure things are being done appropriately so it doesn't get out of hand like Dr. Frankenstein's monster did. I find that fascinating. And look what happens at the end of this Talmud text. It has nothing to do with the creation of people, but rather it deals with genetically modified foods. Does anyone here eat soy products like soy yogurt or rice milk, or you've heard of the concept of golden rice, right? It's fortified with vitamin A and other things, and it's used an awful lot in third world countries in order to provide them with some nourishment. Look what we have here. Rav Chanina v'Rav Oshaya, Havu Yatvi Kol Ma'alei Shabta. So we have two buddies, Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Oshaya. It's like Rabbi Tannenbaum and Rabbi Friedman Cole. They get together every Friday before Shabbat, and what do? V'os ki b'sefer Yitzirah. And they study Jewish texts, and what are they studying? They're studying Sefer Yitzirah. Does anyone know what Sefer Yitzirah is? Sefer Yitzirah is the mystical Kabbalistic book of creation. Do we have any doctors in the room? I know we have one there. What type of medicine do you practice?
General practice.
General practice, okay. If you were to take an atom, or the small, whatever they now call the smallest particle, and you were to split that up to do research on it, a cell, for example, and you were to split up and do research, and you look at it through a microscope, what is the chart that you see? What is it called through that microscope? Chromosomes, but isn't there something smaller there, like a gamete? Okay, and what do they look like? Okay, but what does it look like when you look at it through the microscope, getting it down to its basic pattern? There are many different things, but essentially, you can break it down into a chart where it will look something like this. A, B, C, all the way down to...
It doesn't look like that. That's just the way they code it.
Talk to your friend, Dr. Sherwin, okay? Well, I have to tell you something. If you go ahead and look at Sefer Yitzirah, it's the exact same thing. In fact, it talks about this. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, and then when you go through the entire Aleph, Bet, you go back, and it's Aleph, 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 Bet, Aleph, Gimel. The technology that we use, whether to code or it looks like it, is exactly the same thing as what the mystics understood God to have used to create the world. And look what these two wonderful rabbis did. Umivru lehu igla pilta va'achli le. They created a 3-year-old calf, and they had veal for Shabbos dinner, and they ate it. And again, you have this wonderful text. I don't know if you like veal or not, and whether it was naturally free-range grown or not, this doesn't say. But essentially, there's nobody who argues over whether or not they can create out of nothing this entity that they can use. And the way the text reads is as they did this consistently on Erev Shabbat, before Shabbat came in. The ability for us as Jews to want to be able to create things that do not exist for the promotion and the benefit of human life follows what the Torah teaches us in terms of Jewish ethics. What was the purpose of God's creation of Adam and Chava, of Adam and Eve? For tikkun olam, to help that process of creation and to repair the world, to partner with God. That is the Jewish mission. That is different, in some part, to our Christian friends' view of things. And that also, we'll get to in a minute, is a difference between where we believe life begins and they believe life begins, which offers a whole different perspective on how to view the issues of stem cells and cloning. But look at the second text for a second. What holiday's coming up very soon? Purim. What month are we going to begin this week? Adar Aleph, right? So in Adar Bet, though we have a Purim Katan happening in Adar Aleph, in Adar Bet we have Purim, And so here is a little advertisement for the holiday of Purim. Look at this in the next text. Amar Rava. Hang on, the same character. The same character. Look here. Mi chayav inish liv sume beporya ad de la yada ben aror haman levaruch Mordechai. A person is obligated to have a Purim festive meal and to drink, to have, well, in my case, a Guinness stout, and drink so much Guinness until you cannot tell the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai. And let me tell you, it takes an awful lot of Guinness to get to that point. I know from personal research. All right? But now look at what the text says here. Rabbah. And I have to tell you, I don't believe that the name Rabbah, which appears next, is accurate. I think it's a mistake in the text of the Talmud that we have. And the reason why is because the ending Hey versus the name Rava, which ends in an Aleph, one is Hebrew, the other is Aramaic, often in an oral tradition can be mixed up by accident, not on purpose. And in addition, who was Rava's partner in the other story we read? Rabbi Zera. And so here we have a story, it says Rabbah the Rabbi Zera. I think that's a mistake. I think it should be Rava and not Rabbah. Nonetheless, you still have two great rabbis, and what did they do? Avadu Seudat Purim Bahadeh Hadadeh. They had their Purim meal together. They had a big Purim party. And look what happened. Ibasum, they got sloshed. They had a little too much drink. And look what happened. Kam Rabbah, Rabbah in his non-sober state, gets up, and what does he do to his best friend? I do not recommend this at home. Okay? Shachate le Rabbi Zera, he slaughters. He kills his buddy. Obviously, that's not how you make friends and influence them. Look what happens, though. Limchor ba'e rachame achaye. And the next day, he wakes up with his hangover, and he realizes, oif, I've made a mistake, and he beseeches God, and God goes ahead and resurrects Rabbi Zera. Fascinating. Guess what happens? If you look at the commentaries on this, once again, nobody argues that he couldn't do this, and nobody goes ahead and punishes Rabbah or Rava, whoever he is, for killing his friend. It's fascinating that no one would comment on that, saying, hold it, this is strange. This is an unusual occurrence. Is it that they recognize that this is simply an Agadika tale? That this is a legend? Or is the ethics that are being taught here non-abhorred to the Jewish mindset? Look what happens. L'shana, the next year, Amar le, Netev mar, v'na'aved su'uda purim bahadeh hadadeh. Rabbah goes to his buddy Rabbi Zera and says, hey pal, remember the great time we had last year? Let's do it again. What do you think Rabbi Zera's response is going to be? Would you do it again? Well, not only are you correct and smart, but I imagine Rabbi Zera being a kid from Harlem, New York, okay? Because he would respond in the same way I would, right? And what does he say here? He turns around and goes, Amar le. Rabbi Zera says to Rabbah, he says, Lo bechol sha'ata v'sha'ata mitrachesh nisa. You know, friend, it's not every year that a miracle happens. I'm not about to get involved in this. A human kills another human, and then by requesting God to God in a miracle-working form, right? Doesn't do the power from himself, but asks God to direct that power. That is, with God's knowledge, he brings human life back. Is this any different than what some of our people in the medical world do? when you have story after story that somebody on the operating table, forget Grey's Anatomy and all those shows who seem to make this very sexy and, like this is a common occurrence in the medical world. But it does happen. And what about people who are determined not to live a certain amount of time, but through the knowledge that our doctors and medical community have, they're able to go ahead and live productive, full lives and be cured of their diseases? In some ways, this is very much connected. It seems from these two stories that the issues of human life and the issues of duplicating that human life, that is actually creating something from nothing, is not scary to at least the Talmudic mindset of Jews. How was Adam created? How does the Torah tell us that the first human was created? Right, his name essentially, right? Adam, Adama, right? Man comes from the earth. It is the same story, and we'll get to in a moment, that of the creation of the Golem. And we'll see actually what a Golem is called then. How is his wife, how is Chava, Eve, created? By Adam's rib. Not from non-existing material, but from pre-existing material. Could that be considered a stem cell? You're not the only one. You're in great company. There are many people who think so. Now, some people will say, well, that may well be good, but that's only God's powers. Only God can do that. You as humans have no business playing God. Perhaps, depending on what your perspective of the world is. If your perspective is what I understand the Torah to teach is human mission and why we were created, right? The angels in certain midrashim argue against God right? God goes to the angels and say, hey guys, I'd like to create humans. And the angels say, no way, what are you, crazy? They're going to think they're you. They're going to think they're God. Don't do it. And yet God still goes ahead and does it. Which means that God has a larger mission. God needs partners in this world, and that's you and I. That's a different task than saying that what we do here is usurping what God can do. Please look at the next source. And since we're in somewhat mixed company, I won't tell you about a text that I was shown that came out of the Vatican. By the way, there are certain Jewish texts that have been censored over time. And you can find, if you go back to manuscripts and stuff, sometimes you can find the original text. There happens to be a whole group of sections, especially out of the Tractate of Sanhedrin, which we're going to look at now, dealing with Jesus, that were censored by earlier forms of the Catholic Church. And if you go back and read some things there, you find some very interesting lessons. Whether they're true or not is very difficult to determine, but you read some interesting lessons. Nonetheless, earlier I asked what's the difference between magic and illusion and witchcraft? Well, and wonder-making? We know that wonder-making is the harnessing of God's power to do stuff. Magic is really illusionary stuff. You go to Vegas, you go to Casino Rama, and you see, the guys pull the rabbit out of the hat, or that you see them switching clothes or sawing the person in half, and it's not really doing that. It's entertainment. It doesn't seem like Judaism has a problem with that, but Judaism does have a problem with witchcraft, both biblically as well as rabbinically. And look what we have here. Amar Abaye. Abaye says, Hilchot kishafim kehilchot Shabbat. That the laws of witchcraft are similar to the laws of Shabbat. Can someone explain that to me? How would those two things be linked together? What happens, at least by biblical law, if you violate Shabbat? You get stoned to death. Not the most pleasant thing. And of course, we don't do that today, or else we'd all be in a lot of trouble. But it's a capital punishment. It's a capital crime. And there's a capital punishment for that. And look here. Yesh mehem biskilah. If you violate them, you will be stoned. V'yesh mehem patur aval asor. And there are some of those which are exempt, but they're forbidden. That is, you have rabbinic enactments on those laws that say, even though it's not technically a violation of the Torah text, of the Torah's law, you're still forbidden from doing it. So you're exempt from the punishment of the Torah, but you're still found guilty, and it is not permissible to do what you're doing. And then look what it says. V'yesh mehem mutar lahat chila. And there are those things that would happen on Shabbat that are absolutely permissible from the beginning. And what happens to be one of those? Look at this. Ha'oseh ma'aseh biskila, ha'ochez et ha'einayim pator aval asur mutar lahat chila. The one who gets involved, who performs certain acts, will be stoned to death. And then there's this favorite phrase, ha'ochez et einayim. The one who is the magician, the witchcraft, the illusionist, he's exempt from the Torah law, but it is forbidden. And there are certain things that are permissible from the beginning. And what do they quote here? Kidirav Chanine v'Rav Oshaya kol ma'alei shabta havu oske behilchot yitzira umivrei lahu aglat altla v'achlilei. And what is permissible to do on right before Shabbat? You can create your dinner out of nothing using Sefer Yetzirah. It's not a capital punishment. Jewish ethics, Jewish law says that to engage in the creation of a life form is a positive mitzvah because it helps repair the world where the world is deficient, that is partnering with God. If it was a problem to do so, there would be a capital punishment. It'd be a capital crime. And there's not. Look at now the last source. And here, I just simply want to go ahead and look at a part of this last midrash. And this midrash is from Vayikra Rabbah. And the midrash teaches us the process in which God created the first human. If you look on your sheet, let me see here, I'm using a few different sheets here. Let me see what line is, where I have the big bold words. If you can see on that. Bisha'a Rishona, Allah b'ma chashava. In the first hour of creation of the world, God had a thought, an idea. What was the thought? I want to create humans. I need partners in this world. And look what he does. Bishniya, in the second hour, Nit Ya'etz, turn my page here. Im Ma'ache Hasharei. And he consults in the second hour with his ministering angels. Hey guys, do you think this is a good idea? And we know from other midrashim, they say, no, it's not. And he says, I think it's a good idea. He's the CEO. He's the one in charge, and he vetoes what they say. And look what happens here. Bashlishit, kines afro. And in the third hour, he gathers the dust of the earth. Barivi'it, gibilo. And in the fourth hour, he starts to knead like a baker this earth that he gathered. B'chamishit, rikimo. And in the fifth hour, he forms into the shape of a human. Bashishit, in the sixth hour, asa'o golem. In the sixth hour, he creates a golem. What's a golem? A golem is a human form that does not have the ability or the intelligence to speak. And look here. Bashvi'it, in the seventh hour, nafach bo nishama. He blows into him the breath of life, the neshama, the soul, which then essentially makes him human. And what happens the minute he becomes human? Bashminit, in the eighth hour, hichniso lagan. He places them into Gan Eden. And what happens in Gan Eden? Batishit, in the ninth hour, nitz tava. He is commanded not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Ba'asirit, in the 10th hour, what happens? Avar. Man transgresses, makes a mistake, sins. Ba'achad asrei, nidon. And in the 11th hour, human is judged. B'tishem eser. In the 12th hour, yatsa b'dimus. And in the 12th hour, he is pardoned. Right? He's kicked out of there. But what does the Torah tell us about the original punishment? If man was to eat from this tree, he's supposed to get death. And he doesn't. He's pardoned. This is only part of the Midrash. The rest is about Rosh Hashanah. But notice here, along the different stages of development of creation of human, there's a stage that is called the Golem. And what is the Golem? Well, in biblical Hebrew, the word Golem, or I should say the root Gimel Lamed Mem, appears once. It appears in Psalms, and it means an unformed mass. By the time you get to medieval Hebrew, it means something very different. In modern Hebrew, it means a cocoon. In medieval Hebrew, it means a stem cell or an embryonic stem cell. It is part of the process of creation. And so I now ask you the following question. What is the Christian opinion on when life begins? Okay, fine, but when, according to Christian view, when does human life begin? Moment of conception, moment of fertilization. Is that the Jewish view? What is the Jewish view? There is a wide range of understanding. The earliest time is when the baby's head crowns from its mother and fully becomes human on the 31st day of life. That's when we do the Pinyon Haben. Those are two very different ways of looking at life. The first one says that you have a life form as a small embryonic stem cell. We understand that to be a life form, but not a human life form. There's a difference there. We wait until the child is fully developed and for the most part is able to function on its own. Can we engage in practices of cloning and of stem cell research? Well, currently there may be other ways of getting to those end results which may be preferable. On the other hand, perhaps if there is a real need because we can complete God's or work in completing God's mission and making a more perfect world, in helping keep people alive, perhaps we have a goal, a task, a mission, in order to use the knowledge that God gave us to do such things. Should we or should we not do it? Our texts say there's not an issue with us doing it. It's now whether or not the time is right. And if we do engage in these processes, then we need to do it with some hesitation and with a check and balance system. Whether the government agencies we have are good enough of a check and balance system to make sure that things are going to become a Superman that is a protective entity for the world versus Frankenstein's monster that is something that causes havoc on the earth and causes problem. Well, I'll let you decide whether or not you would support your government allowing these things to happen or not. But it seems from a Jewish ethical point of view, we would allow these things to take place. Question?
Retellings of the story, as they keep rewriting and rewriting his life every time they start another version of comic books. There's often a point somewhere, like sometime long after he lived on Earth, that after he and Lex Luthor have had some battles, Superman it's usually a different reason each time, but he turns evil for a short period of time, and then afterwards, the whole Earth is very worried that it could happen again.
Right. And the scary thing is, this was a Jewish legend that seem to influence this cartoon character. I don't know if you saw the last movie, right, which was not made by the people who did the DC comics, but there was actually a scene in the last movie, see, this is my childhood coming out into practical life, where you have the Superman character flying up over the earth, and he's literally been changed from the Jewish Golem into the Christian Messiah because he's flying over the earth in very much of one of these positions. Okay? And it's changed from the protector of the human race to the savior of the human race. Now, I mean, that's problematic for the authenticity of what the legend actually was about, but you could see the development there, and you could see the influence of different schools of thought. That latter school of thought would probably very much argue against allowing certain medical things to happen. And in fact, if you go back and look at the medical developments that we've had over the last 30 years, if not longer, each time the medical community, the scientific community wants to take an advancement, it's that voice which turns around and says, you can't do it, it's playing God. And it's the Jewish voice which seems to step up and say, but hang on for a second. We're partnering with God here. You had your hand up before.
Oh, no, I was just wanting some clarification on how the process of stem cells works, like how they're, like is it from an embryo and then
There
cells
are
are taken and...
There are, I am not, as they say, Baki, I am not fluent in the medical aspects of this stuff. I'm only looking at Jewish texts and seeing if the concept is allowed within our tradition and how we as Jews may want to think about it. There are different times. There's the self-harvesting of stem cells, and then there's the actual taking of a stem cell and putting it into like a petri dish and splitting that and creating life from there. But essentially, from my understanding, it's taking an already live entity and then building off of that. It's a basic building block of human life or of life in general. Right. And I'm not here to bash Christian people. I mean, they have a very sophisticated belief system, understanding that the Jewish ethical value stands different, right, than what that thought is. And it seems from a theoretical point of view that their particular thought process on these issues is very debilitating to the medical and scientific community in terms of saving and protecting lives, because very much they would not want to allow certain things to happen. But the Jewish view, which seems to have, at least within North America, seems to be the motivating factor because it is a more open understanding of the situation. That is, it says, well, doesn't say yes and it doesn't say no. It says kind of like maybe so. Can we do it? Yes, we can do it. But should we? And then that becomes a sociological debate, a policy debate, versus an ethical debate. And I think that's very different. Other thoughts, questions, comments? Let's give somebody else a chance. Well, it's interesting. In 1998, the Knesset took a vote because an Israeli scientist and doctor who happened to be living abroad actually had developed the ability to do cloning, and the Knesset had to respond to this situation. And what did the Knesset do? The Knesset did not say yes, it did not say no. It said, let's put a moratorium and wait 5 years before we decide what to do. At that point, Professor Rabbi David Golinkin, who may be very known to this congregation, as well as other congregations in Toronto, wrote a teshuvah, a responsa, stating that the Knesset was absolutely correct in waiting that 5-year period. And he quotes a whole bunch of sources, 5 sources in favor, 6 sources against. The problem is the sources that he wrote in favor and the sources that he wrote against never spoke about the issue of cloning. They only spoke about the procedure of making decisions. And he never once quotes, with the exception of the Meiri, he never quotes any comment at all about the legend of the Golem to influence our decision making on this. I recently sent him a paper that I wrote on the topic. I'm waiting for his response to see if he's been willing to change his perspective on the issue. So, are you in favor of doing these things or not? You're shaking your head.
Yeah.
Why?
I don't know. I don't know. If I was sick, I'd probably want it to happen. So.
The fear that we all have is that we're going to get a Dr. Frankenstein, right? And the fear is that something bad's going to happen. Well, in my opinion, for whatever it's worth, and if you don't like me, that's okay. I'm leaving town in a few months, okay? But in my opinion, that fear, when life is at stake, we need to find a way of dealing with that fear in other ways, and we have to have faith in humanity and in God's world, and that we can go ahead and through the systems and structures we develop, we can put that check and balance so things like what happened in the 20th century and World War II do not happen again. It's hard to trust humans to do those things because we have past precedent. In fact, we have current precedent, what's happening in Iran, all right, and what happened in Iraq and other places, which may not lend us to want to trust humans. I hear that. But life's at stake here, so what do we do?
I think these warning stories like Frankenstein or like Faustus or Icarus, there are all these stories of warning people of going too far, and these are the consequences if you do. For me, I think life is at stake, and there's many ways you can do this ethically, and the fear that people have is not in itself, but the way they can be used. So if, for example, you could engineer people to be more intelligent or to be stronger, and then you get into like capitalistic issues of, well, who can pay for that, or are you rejecting, children because they're not going to be smart enough, so you'll abort them. Like, it gets into that whole realm of things, which again has nothing to do with the process itself, but how you use it.
Well said.
Which grants the hesitation, I think.
Right.
Which doesn't mean no.
The issue of cloning raises a scary issue for Jews. That is pre-selection, right? That is, I've decided I want a girl to be born and I want her to have red hair and whatever color eyes and I want her to look like this, blah, 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 blah. That is a very scary thing because of our experience in the last century in the Shoah, all right? That whole selection thing where Hitler wanted a particular race. But that's not what cloning's about, right? Could it be led to that? You are absolutely right. If the technology is there to do one thing, it's going to be there to do the other thing. But so is there not a way of making that one thing illegal and not permissible, but still allow the things that can help the world? You're saying no. Why? It's challenging, and to be honest with you, it's very frustrating because you could see something that is so positive to help people, right, be taken in a way which it was never meant to be taken. And that's the curse and the blessing of being human, okay? We're not God, right? We do make mistakes, right? That first text said the difference between us and God is that we sin. We make mistakes, okay? How do we keep that in check in order to partner with God? I don't know if we're there yet, but the breakthrough that the Oregon scientists have had, the breakthrough that Israeli scientists have had in terms of being able to do that, there's I grew up in my most formative years, I guess, in the 1980s, right? And what Canadian was on TV in the 1980s who influenced the Reagan era in the U.S.? A good Canadian by the name of Michael J. Fox. You may have heard him, right? Michael P. Keaton on the television show. He's suffering from Parkinson's disease right now. And I am moving to Kansas City, Kansas and Missouri. It's really one city to split by a river. And last year, during a midterm election for Congress, you saw him all over the TV advocating for stem cell research. Last Monday night, President George Bush was giving his State of the Union as a lame duck president. I'm only saying that because it's his last year. And what comment did he make? He talked about stem cell research, and he made an interesting comment that we should not offer patents on these things. And the Christian crowd stands up and starts cheering. Woohoo! Everyone should cheer for that, because what is a patent over a life form? It's slavery. Right? When one human owns another life, that's slavery. And there's no other way of looking at that. But he never would talk about the issue of whether this can also be helpful, not patenting, but using to help medical science deal with some of these diseases. I guess a larger question, which we don't have time for today, is if we have this technology and we can do it, is it worthwhile perfecting the world so that there are none of these diseases, or diseases in general, just a natural cause of life that keep the population in check and that they're supposed to be there? That's a much, much larger issue. And that one, you can write your dissertation on. I'm not about to engage in that process. Last comments or thoughts before I let you go. Yes, sir.
God created man, gave him intelligence. That's a two-sided sword. You cannot legislate the way people are going to think. Consequently, any person dealing in that, any medical person dealing in that, you can't say, you cannot do this. His curiosity, the brain that he was given, will link him possibly to go beyond that. And to say by legislation, this is legal, this is not. We have legislation on many things that we can't stop. There's legislation against guns. People have guns. You have legislation, don't climb over this fence, it's a railroad track. People climb over the fence, they didn't get hit by a railroad train. Legislation is not be all and end all of controlling things.
And so there's
stopgap measure. It's the best you have in an imperfect world. But the thing is that what I'm trying to get at is that genius of taking people, create and clone, also can take them beyond, because they won't stop at this point. Their curiosity and their genius will want them to take to the next point.
You could very well be correct. That being said, if our tradition is going to have any relevance in the world in which you and I live, then it needs to be able to speak towards real issues that you and I are dealing with. How is it that your family members get sick and don't come out of the hospital? How is it that we have issues of corporations running havoc, becoming Frankensteins, getting protection under the law as artificial entities, which prevents them from being sued, okay? But yet, they still get other benefits as human natural life, and they are not in any way. Look what happened in World War II. I.G. Farben, right, was the backer of every single Auschwitz camp, both work camps and death facilities. Why? They wanted to generate business, and they enslaved Jews and other people to be their workers. It is corporations who were protected under civil law who were able to go ahead and do that and kill 6 million of our people. Goes back to when in the United States, President Lincoln, okay, in terms of the Santa Clara Railroad Station, how you had these railroad stations or railroad companies who needed protection in order to enhance their business. And they came together as conglomerates, and they formed corporations, and they were deemed as artificial entities. Look what just happened a couple years ago with Enron. How many people, no different than you and I, have entirely lost their life savings and are now out of jobs and are way below the poverty line now because we did not listen to our sources, our texts, on how to prevent these sort of things from happening. You're right, anything can happen, but if we do not start speaking up and start arguing for what I would consider to be more accurate understandings and reads of Jewish sources to influence the world, then you know something? I think we're going to take the world back and not move them forward. And I would, unfortunately, to some extent, rather err on the caution side of moving forward. I'm not saying leap into this stuff. Forget it. It's dangerous. It's complicated. But if we don't start taking those steps forward, we're going to end up taking a lot of steps backwards. And unfortunately, I think you just witnessed this last week in the United States. I'm trying to decide who I'm going to vote for president of the United States because I'm moving back. And the candidate that I would have voted for was just taken out of the entire, actually he suspended his campaign, right? Why? Because he's refused to take lobbyist money. He's refused to want to be under the influence of the corporations, and that was John Edwards. And he came out publicly and said it, and what happened? He lost all support. He wasn't willing to play the game. Rather, he wanted to fight the system. He was absolutely correct. His idea was helping the average human, the average citizen of the U.S., and not give in to the larger corporations that only have their self-interest. And so now he's out of the race. But legends like the Golem legend, and there are thousands of others, right? And there's thousands of different texts that can help influence the way we think about any issue. I think there's, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are two different ways of doing Jewish studies. There's looking at a text and trying to understand the words, and based on that simple text, glean meaning from its original, what we think the original meaning was. And the other way is simply by going ahead and looking at the vast literature on any given topic and seeing what the thrust of teaching is on that. I prefer the latter versus the former. Thank you very much.